In the early hours of February 10, 1567, the people of Edinburgh were torn from their sleep by an enormous explosion. Windows shook. Doors flew open. And above the dark rooftops, smoke began rising into the Scottish night. The blast had come from a house known as Kirkhope Field, where Henry Stuart, better known as Lord Darnley, had been recovering from an illness. Darnley was not an ordinary nobleman. He was the husband of Mary, Queen of Scots. He was the father of Scotland's infant heir. And by sunrise he was dead. At first, the answer appeared obvious. The explosion had destroyed the house, so the explosion must have killed him. But then searchers found Darnley's body. He was not buried beneath the ruins. He was lying outside, in a nearby garden or orchard, beside the body of one of his servants. Both men were only partially dressed, as though they had fled in a hurry. Most strangely, their bodies did not appear to have been destroyed by the blast. Contemporary accounts suggested that Darnley had been strangled or suffocated. The explosion may not have been the murder. It may have been an attempt to hide one. And almost immediately, Scotland began asking the question that would follow Mary for the rest of her life. Did the Queen of Scots know that her husband was going to die? Suspicion quickly centered on one of Scotland's most powerful noblemen, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. But Bothwell was not the only person whose name became connected to the crime. Because on the night of the murder, Mary had been inside Kirkhope Field. She had spent part of the evening with her husband. Then, only hours before the explosion, she had left. Was it a coincidence? Was Mary an innocent wife who escaped death by chance? Or had she walked away knowing exactly what was about to happen? To understand why her own subjects believed a queen might help destroy her husband, we have to go back to the beginning of a marriage that promised to strengthen a dynasty, but instead became a trap for everyone inside it. Mary Stuart had been surrounded by power from the moment she was born. She became Queen of Scotland while still an infant. For much of her childhood, however, she lived not in Scotland but in France, where she was educated at the French royal court. She grew up speaking French, surrounded by music, poetry, religion, diplomacy, and the dangerous rituals of European monarchy. In 1558, Mary married Francis, heir to the French throne. The following year, he became King Francis II, making Mary both Queen of Scotland and Queen Consort of France. But her life in France did not last. Francis died in December 1560, leaving Mary a young widow without a secure future at the French court. In August 1561, she returned to Scotland to rule the country she had left as a child. The Scotland waiting for her was deeply divided. Mary was Catholic. But the Scottish Reformation had transformed much of the country's political and religious order. Powerful Protestant nobles watched their Catholic queen carefully, uncertain whether she would preserve the new settlement or attempt to reverse it. And beyond Scotland stood another queen. Elizabeth I ruled England to the south. Mary was a great-granddaughter of Henry VII and believed she possessed a strong dynastic claim to the English throne. To many Catholics who questioned Elizabeth's legitimacy, Mary was not merely the Queen of Scots. She was a possible future Queen of England. That made every choice Mary made more dangerous. Her marriage would not simply determine who shared her bed. It could shape the future of Scotland, England, and the religious balance of Britain. Mary needed an heir. She needed a husband with royal blood. She needed someone strong enough to reinforce her position without becoming a threat to her authority. Then Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, arrived in Scotland. He was young, tall, handsome, Catholic, and closely connected to both the Scottish and English royal families. On paper, he looked almost perfect. But what happens when the man chosen to protect a queen decides he would rather control her? Mary and Darnley were married at Holyrood House on July 29, 1565. The following day, Mary proclaimed him King of Scots. But Darnley wanted more than a royal title. He wanted what was known as the crown matrimonial, a position that could allow him to retain royal authority if Mary died and potentially rule in his own right. Mary refused to give it to him. That refusal helped expose the central problem in their marriage. Darnley had married a queen, but he did not want to remain merely the queen's husband. He wanted power equal to hers. Perhaps even power over her. The marriage also alarmed important Protestant nobles. Mary's half-brother, James Stuart, Earl of Moray, opposed the union and led a rebellion that was eventually defeated. At first, Mary and Darnley appeared united. They traveled together and faced down their opponents. But victory did not make the marriage stronger. It made Darnley more ambitious. Accounts from the period portray him as unpredictable, arrogant, and increasingly resentful of anyone who possessed influence over Mary. And one man in particular became the focus of that resentment. His name was David Rizzio. Rizzio was an Italian musician who had risen within Mary's household and become one of her private secretaries. Because he was close to the Queen, enemies accused him of controlling royal decisions. Rumors spread that Rizzio had become too powerful. Some even whispered that his relationship with Mary was not merely political. There was no reliable proof that he was her lover. But in a royal court, a rumor did not need to be true to become dangerous. Darnley became convinced, or allowed himself to be convinced, that Rizzio stood between him and the authority he believed he deserved. A group of Scottish nobles saw an opportunity. They wanted Rizzio removed. Darnley wanted greater control over his wife. Together, they formed a conspiracy. And on the night of March 9, 1566, that conspiracy entered the Queen's private rooms. Mary was pregnant when the men came for David Rizzio. She was dining in a small room at the palace of Holyrood House. Rizzio was nearby, along with several members of her household. Then Darnley entered. Behind him came armed nobles. The room was small. There was nowhere to retreat. Rizzio realized what was happening and tried to remain close to the Queen, perhaps believing that her presence would protect him. It did not. The conspirators dragged him away from Mary and attacked him. Royal collection records describe him as having been stabbed more than 50 times. Mary was forced to witness the killing while carrying Darnley's child. And her own husband had helped the murderers enter. The attack was more than the killing of a secretary. It was an act of intimidation against the Queen herself. The conspirators hoped to isolate Mary, control the government, and strengthen Darnley's authority. But they underestimated her. Mary persuaded Darnley that the nobles were using him, and that once they no longer needed him, he too could be discarded. Darnley changed sides. He helped Mary escape from Holyrood House, leaving many of his fellow conspirators exposed. It was a remarkable political reversal. But it came at a price. Darnley had now betrayed almost everyone. He had betrayed Mary by participating in Rizzio's murder. Then he betrayed the nobles who had carried it out. He was no longer trusted by his wife. He was no longer trusted by the conspirators. And he was increasingly isolated from the political world around him. 3 months later, in June 1566, Mary gave birth to a son, James. The birth should have secured the marriage and strengthened the dynasty. Instead, Darnley found himself pushed even further to the edges of royal life. He was absent from the great celebrations surrounding his son's baptism later that year. By then, the marriage between Mary and Darnley had almost completely broken down. Yet Darnley remained dangerous. He was the Queen's husband. He was the father of the heir. He had his own claim to the English succession. Mary could not easily divorce him without risking questions about their son's legitimacy or creating another political crisis. So what could be done with a royal husband who was too powerful to ignore, too dangerous to trust, and too well connected to remove peacefully? By the end of 1566, some Scottish nobles were already discussing how Darnley might be separated from the Queen. Whether Mary agreed to murder, or merely to some lawful means of removing him, remains one of the most disputed questions in the entire story. But only weeks later Darnley would be dead. Near the end of 1566, Darnley left the royal court and went to stay with his father in Glasgow. There, he became seriously ill. The exact nature of the illness remains uncertain. Contemporary descriptions referred to marks or sores on his body, leading some historians to suggest smallpox and others to suspect syphilis. Whatever the cause, Darnley was weakened and vulnerable. Then Mary came to see him. This visit would later become one of the most suspicious parts of the story. Why would Mary personally travel to retrieve a husband she no longer trusted? Was she attempting a genuine reconciliation? Did she hope to bring him back under royal supervision? Or was she leading him toward a place where his enemies could reach him more easily? Mary persuaded Darnley to return to Edinburgh. But instead of placing him at Holyrood Palace, he was lodged at the old provost's house near Kirkove Field. The explanation was that the location offered cleaner air and a quieter place for his recovery. Mary visited him regularly, and to outside observers it may have appeared that the marriage was improving. But behind the walls of the city, another force was moving closer to the Queen. James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, was a powerful nobleman and one of Mary's most trusted supporters. He was bold, militarily experienced, and politically useful. He would also become the leading suspect in Darnley's murder. Later accusations claimed that Bothwell and a group of conspirators transported gunpowder to Kirkove Field and placed it beneath or near Darnley's rooms. How much Mary knew, if anything, has never been conclusively established. But consider the position she was in. Her marriage had become a source of humiliation and danger. Her husband had helped murder a man in front of her. Many nobles wanted Darnley removed. And one of her strongest allies may have had both the means and the determination to do it. Did Mary ask questions she did not want answered? Did she suspect what Bothwell was planning but remain silent? Or was she completely unaware that while she visited her husband, barrels of gunpowder were being prepared beneath the same roof? By February 9th, all the pieces were in place. Darnley was inside Kirkove Field. Mary was with him. And somewhere in Edinburgh, the men responsible for the coming explosion were waiting for the Queen to leave. On the evening of February 9th, 1567, Mary visited Darnley at Kirkove Field. The scene may have appeared almost peaceful. The king was recovering in his room. Mary spent time with him. Members of the household moved through the building. Outside, Edinburgh settled into the winter night. But Mary had another engagement. One of her servants, Bastian Pages, was celebrating his wedding at Holyrood House. Mary eventually left Kirkove Field to attend the festivities. That decision saved her life. Or provided her with an alibi. Depending on what one believes. Her torchlit party moved through the streets toward the palace. Behind her, Darnley remained in the house with his servants. At some point after midnight, the area around Kirkove Field grew quiet. Then came the explosion. At approximately 2 in the morning, gunpowder tore through the building. The house collapsed, scattering stone, timber, and debris. But Darnley was not found beneath it. His body and that of his servant William Taylor were discovered outside. Nearby objects shown in an early drawing of the scene included clothing, a dagger, a chair, and other items that raised further questions. Some modern reconstructions suggest Darnley may have realized the house was surrounded. He and Taylor might have escaped from an upper level using a rope and chair, made their way outside, and then encountered the killers. According to this interpretation, the two men were suffocated before the gunpowder exploded. But no reconstruction has answered every question. Why was Darnley outside? Who warned him? Did he hear the conspirators moving beneath his room? Was the house destroyed after his death to erase evidence? Or was the explosion meant to kill him, with the murder outside becoming an improvised second plan after he escaped? Mary was awakened at Holyrood House by news of the blast. She ordered an investigation and offered a reward for information. But before any court had reached a conclusion, the streets of Edinburgh had already chosen their suspects. Anonymous notices began appearing. One name was repeated again and again. Bothwell. And alongside his name, people began drawing another figure. A crowned mermaid, an insulting symbol intended to represent Mary. The message was unmistakable. The people were not merely accusing a nobleman of murder. They were accusing the Queen of helping him. James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, was brought to trial for Darnley's murder in April 1567. He was acquitted. But the verdict did not end the suspicion. To many of Mary's enemies, it confirmed that the process had been controlled, and that a powerful man had escaped justice. Then the story took an even more damaging turn. Later that same month, Bothwell intercepted Mary while she was traveling back from Stirling, where she had visited her son. He took her to Dunbar Castle. What happened there remains deeply contested. Some accounts describe Mary as having been abducted and coerced. Others have argued that the seizure may have been arranged with her consent. What is certain is what happened next. Bothwell ended his previous marriage. And on May 15th, only 3 months after Darnley's murder, Mary married the man widely suspected of arranging it. To Mary's enemies, the marriage looked like a confession. Why would an innocent queen marry the suspected murderer of her husband? But there are other possibilities. Mary may have believed Bothwell was the only man powerful enough to protect her. She may have been forced into the marriage after being abducted. Or she may have become politically and personally dependent on him at the worst possible moment. Whatever the truth, the marriage destroyed what remained of her authority. Scottish nobles who had once served Mary now raised forces against her and Bothwell. The two sides confronted each other at Carberry Hill in June 1567. Mary surrendered. Bothwell escaped. They would never see each other again. Mary was taken to Loch Leven Castle and imprisoned. On July 24th, she was forced to abdicate in favor of her 1-year-old son, who became King James VI. In less than 6 months, Mary had gone from ruling Scotland to losing her husband, marrying his suspected killer, facing rebellion, losing her freedom, and surrendering her crown. The explosion at Kirk Field had destroyed one building. But the decisions that followed destroyed a monarchy. After Mary's fall, her enemies produced what appeared to be the most damaging evidence against her. A small casket was said to contain letters and poems written by Mary to Bothwell. These documents became known as the casket letters. If genuine, they appeared to suggest an intimate relationship between Mary and Bothwell before Darnley's death. Some interpreted the wording as evidence that Mary had known about, or participated in, the murder plot. But the originals did not survive. The documents were copied, translated, presented by Mary's political opponents, and used at a time when those same opponents benefited enormously from her removal. Mary denied writing them and was not allowed to inspect the original documents directly during the proceedings in England. Historians have argued over the letters ever since. Were they authentic? Were genuine letters altered? Were parts of them forged? Or were they entirely fabricated to justify taking the crown from Mary? There is no universally accepted answer. And the fate of the letters is not the only mystery. There was no modern forensic investigation. The crime scene was disturbed. Political factions controlled testimony. Those accused had reasons to lie. Those investigating had reasons to shape the result. Bothwell was almost certainly connected to the conspiracy in some form, but he may not have acted alone. Several Scottish nobles appear to have wanted Darnley removed, and some of the men who later condemned Mary may have known far more about the plot than they admitted. That is what makes the murder of Lord Darnley so difficult to solve. Nearly everyone surrounding the case had something to gain. Mary could be freed from a disastrous marriage. Bothwell could move closer to the Queen. Protestant nobles could weaken a Catholic monarch. Mary's half-brother Moray could become regent for her infant son. And Elizabeth I could contain a rival claimant to the English throne. When every witness has a motive, where does the truth begin? There are 3 broad ways to interpret Mary's role in Darnley's death. The first is that she was directly involved. According to this view, Mary had grown to hate and fear her husband. She had become close to Bothwell, approved the murder plot, and deliberately left Kirk Field before the gunpowder was ignited. Her rapid marriage to Bothwell and the casket letters are presented as the strongest evidence against her. The second possibility is more complicated. Mary may not have ordered the murder, but she may have suspected that powerful nobles intended to remove Darnley. Perhaps she chose not to ask how. Perhaps she believed they meant exile, divorce, or political separation rather than death. Perhaps she understood enough to remain silent but not enough to know the precise plan. The third possibility is that Mary was innocent. In this interpretation, Bothwell and other nobles acted without her knowledge. After Darnley's death, they manipulated, abducted, or pressured her into decisions that made her appear guilty. Her enemies then used those decisions, and possibly falsified letters, to remove a queen they already distrusted. Each explanation solves part of the mystery. None explains everything. If Mary planned the murder, why leave so many political risks unresolved? If she knew nothing, why did she place so much trust in Bothwell afterward? If she was forced to marry him, why did she fail to communicate the danger clearly to supporters who might have helped her? And if the casket letters were genuine, why did the original documents disappear? Mary escaped from Loch Leven Castle in 1568, and attempted to regain her throne. After her forces were defeated, she crossed into England, expecting assistance from Elizabeth I. Instead, Elizabeth ordered her detained. Mary would spend almost 19 years in English captivity before being executed in 1587 after becoming implicated in a separate plot against Elizabeth. But long before the executioner entered the Great Hall at Fotheringhay Castle, Mary's fate had already been shaped by that winter night in Edinburgh. The explosion did not prove she was guilty. The bodies did not reveal who ordered the crime. The trial did not deliver a convincing answer. And the letters did not end the argument. But politics does not always wait for certainty. Sometimes suspicion is enough. Mary Stuart began this story as one of the most powerful women in Europe. She was a queen from infancy. A former queen of France. A Catholic monarch ruling a divided Scotland. A mother whose son could one day inherit 2 kingdoms. But by the end, she had become a prisoner accused of helping murder her own husband. Was Mary guilty? Perhaps. She had strong reasons to want Darnley removed, and her behavior after his death created questions she could never escape. But motive is not proof. A disastrous marriage is not a murder confession. And a suspicious decision does not tell us whether it was made freely, fearfully, or under pressure. Mary may have been a conspirator. She may have known enough to remain silent. Or she may have been surrounded by men who committed a murder, and then allowed the blame to fall upon her. More than 4.5 centuries later, the final answer remains beyond our reach. But one thing is certain. The explosion at Kirkhoe Field did more than destroy a house. It destroyed trust in Mary's rule. It turned a queen into a suspect. It gave her enemies the weapon they needed. And it began the chain of events that cost Mary Stuart her freedom, her crown, and eventually her life. Darnley's murder remains unsolved. Mary's guilt remains disputed. And somewhere between the destroyed house, the missing evidence, and the letters that may or may not have been real, lies the part of history we may never know. Because history does not always preserve the truth. Sometimes, it preserves only the accusation.